Welcome everyone, we are back. Live, everything looks to be working. Day 7. Been streaming every day. We've got live UA map working again. We've got access to different... I've subscribed to it. So we've got access to different maps or whatever. And it seems to load a bit quicker. We've got flight radar. Forte 10, which we saw in the Black Sea first few days, looks to be doing some interesting flight plans up to Gdansk and North Poland. We've got the usual cameras. I've got Taiwanese. The sound is actually coming from the Taiwanese camera. I think we possibly saw this camera yesterday, although not as well illuminated. So this is a new camera here. But I've got Taiwanese camera in the background where it looks to be snowing actually. Welcome Flat Out, Matt Sprong, Just a Kobe Fan, Al, MBR, Southgate, Richie, Ethan, James, Visual, MBR, DM, Christopher, Sherry as well. You're not too bad. Hope everyone's doing well. Hope everyone's not... I personally feel as though it's not as I don't know, it was over the weekend, it was very gripping constantly. I feel as though it's a bit more balanced now in terms of how gripping it is. I don't know if anyone feels the same way. Welcome Jolanda, Stasi. Welcome Blaze, Kosher, welcome everyone. So yeah, day 7, obviously we saw... It looks like cruise missiles were used in both Kharkiv and Kyiv. There's a freeze frame of the bomb that shot... the missile that deployed on the state building in central Kharkiv, and it looks to be a cruise missile. I imagine it was the same for the missile that hit the television. Television mast in Kyiv. Still reports of fighting in Irpin and this airport here that looks to be one of the most critical strategic points of battle for Kyiv, really. In Kherson as well in the south, I've heard that the mayor is meeting with the Russian forces, so Kherson looks to have is on the verge of being occupied. Welcome Pollock, welcome Andy, Black, welcome everyone. Coach, as I suggested a day ago, I think the bombing will continue to get worse as progress slows. I feel like there's been a bit more space the last few days to focus on what this means globally and diplomacy. I understand there's going to be more diplomatic meetings tomorrow between the Ukrainian representatives and Russian representatives. There's been more times for the sanctions to bite. There's been big news in the UK about Roman Abramovich selling Chelsea, which is possibly has been the most prominent example of Russian oligarch kind of soft power. I think in Germany as well, I don't know which city, but somewhere in Germany, Alisher Uzimovs, I think he recently bought Everton Football Club, has been seized. Richie, yeah, I've got ADB up as well, but ADB wasn't loading for me really, so... Yeah, just gone over into Belarus, this plane. That's a very unusual... Hang on, no, from Bratislava, not Vienna. Yep, so that is an unusual flight plan. MBR says internet and TV functional Kyiv. I saw reports today that a heating pipeline has been destroyed. But you can see from the lights here, they look to have electricity still. Welcome, David. Welcome, Hundreds. Welcome, Nathan. Nathan, I'm wildly impressed by Ukraine's ability to defend against Russia. We did get the first reports today from Russia on Russian casualties. Let me see if I can get it. Bear with me. Bear with me a second. Yeah, so Russia said today that they have lost 498 troops. I think the figures from Ukraine are over 5,000 Russian troops, either killed or wounded. So you could say that the likely figure is possibly somewhere in the middle. And either which way, that is a huge amount of soldiers to lose by Western standards, but we've been discussing maybe it's more palatable in Russia. Yeah, something like that, Sweetmore. I think Russia also gave an indication of Ukrainian casualties, which might have been something like 3,000, I'm not sure. Nathan, are you surprised by how long it has taken for Russia to capture city? I am. So on these streams on the very first day, I said, I didn't see how Ukraine could really resist this Russian invasion, but I think my standards of, I was equating the Russian military capacity, and especially in establishing air superiority with what we've seen from Western countries and their Middle East conflicts, and B, it's possible that Russia expected to be welcomed in much more by the Ukrainian citizens, especially in the east, and it looks like that hasn't happened. But it looks like Kherson is going to be the first major city to be inverted commas occupied. Do we like the satellite maps, by the way? We've got 2 satellite maps here. Yeah, I read briefly about this Romanian jet. So a MiG-21 is a very old... Even MiG-29s are quite old. A MiG-21 is a very old fighter jet. So this may be one of these... I don't know too much about it. It may be one of these things that's just, you know, a coincidence it's happened at the same time. I understand there's storms around here. In fact, we can get the weather up. Oh, sorry, we can get the cloud up maybe. So, again, I'm neither a military expert or a weatherman, woman, but possibly a storm, I don't know. Okay, satellite maps are good. Again, if anyone's got any more, we're very lucky because this channel is an established channel and it's monetized. People can donate if they want, and we can subscribe to you know, whatever platforms are going to be helpful. So I don't know if anyone's read or seen about this Romanian fighter jet. I did see a briefing today by the US Secretary of State for Defense at the Pentagon, who was very clear about no desire to get drawn into a conflict with Russia. I also saw an interview with an ex quite high-ranking military general from NATO, who said that essentially as a result of this conflict, inevitably there is going to be severe militarization of what is effectively NATO's border. And we're already basically back in a Cold War situation. We've spoken a lot about where the de facto border is. I don't know what it means to be Moldova right now. Because Moldova isn't in NATO. So I don't know what's being done to, what the view of Moldova is, or what's being done to support Moldova. But given that the West has essentially said the real border is here, is NATO's border. I don't know what that means for Moldova. Yeah, there are nuclear reactors in Ukraine. There are nuclear reactors, like active ones, as I understand it. That and the rescue helicopter went down. I don't know, a MiG-21 I know is a very old fighter jet, so I don't know anything else about it. So yeah, Russian force on the way in Kherson to kind of negotiate some sort of, inverted commas, peacekeeping arrangement. There is a storm, they're okay. So I was trying to sort out my geography. I don't know where it was. I mean, it's still obviously on Romanian soil if it's here. Welcome, Lee. I've heard the reactors in Ukraine have been pulled from NATO. I don't know about that. I'm just going to grab a cough sweet because I've got a tickly cough actually. Just bear with me. I'll be 20 seconds. Got some blue strepsils. I've never seen blue strepsils. Slightly exotic. Yeah, I saw the vote today. Let's try and get the vote. One of these things I think I've noticed in these streams is I feel like it's okay to say that the West, there were failings in the West in what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. It's okay to say there were failings there and also criticise what Russia is doing. It's okay to say that there have been wars in other parts of the world that haven't been given prominence, haven't been given sufficient media attention in the West or support. And also that this is wrong. It feels like it's a little bit of whataboutism to, and this is something that I've noticed from some senior Indian politicians, is, oh, because we mustn't forget what happened in what the West has done in earlier conflicts. But it does feel a little bit like whataboutism to me. Kind of what Modulated Horizons is saying. So USA invaded more countries and bombed more innocents in the country. Okay. So if we take that, what is your view on the situation in Ukraine? Matt, been asking around the world for 4 days and no one can tell me specifically what countries are the West. It's interesting because in some ways, however, for example, the United Nations, whatever the prevailing view is in the United Nations, in some ways is the West. But yeah, there is no definition of the West. It's not geographical either, because you'd probably include Australia in the West. Okay, so this is different. There's a 40-mile long armor column. This is a different kind of war. This is full out blitzkrieg. Well, I think it looked like, in some ways, they were trying to blitzkrieg, and multiple reports they had issues with supplying fuel and supplies, etc. Logistical issues, but we will see. It seems pretty evident that this armor column here is backed up. Brian, there needs to be consistency in the international system. Other nations have interest, don't care. Good, then make sure you're strong. It depends what your view is on international relations, whether you're capital R realist or not, and therefore whether states should act in absolute self-interest or whether there is a greater aim. Taylor, this is just like if you see someone being bullied, you stand up for them and not let them get beaten up. They need help. It's true, but it's kind of the threat of World War III is another factor there. I don't know about that, Will Bates. Southgate, more of a cultural thing, I'd say. Yeah, it's kind of hard to put your finger on it, I guess. There will be definitions out there. Dylan, like the USA have done some pretty bad things and I've hated it, but that it doesn't mean Russia gets a free pass. Daniel, what's the difference between the invasion of Ukraine and the invasion of Iraq, in your opinion? That's a very good and very loaded question. Obviously, in Putin's statement on the first day of the war, he specifically raised Iraq as an example of not only the West's failure, but the failure of the international system framework, the United Nations, to prevent it happening. So, for example, in his view, the United Nations was swayed with what turned out to be not so solid evidence. It is a very good question, and it's one that's going to be very divisive. But again, if you accept there were significant failings, intelligence-wise, operational-wise, etc. Okay, but what is your view on what is happening now, and in what way does what happened previously affect how you feel about what's happening now? Right, Brave Dove, I don't want to get too specific, but you talk about Iraq and then talk about the Taliban. That you're conflating two very different wars, possibly. James, what's the blue planes? I don't actually know what the blue planes are. I've seen there's more blue planes in America, usually. Let's see. Okay, there aren't. I don't actually know what the blue planes are, I'm afraid. Jonathan, I'm not entirely sure if Ukraine is or is not innocent, but I just think war is stupid. David, sounds obvious, but why didn't Ukraine think of this and get a fortified wall to protect themselves? I think there's lots of reasons I think why they wouldn't have been able to do that. Shooting, is it Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction, the UN were lied to by US intelligence, you just took it. I'm not disputing any of those things. And and those things were specifically referred to by Putin in the statement. I'm just saying, okay, what is your view on what's happening in Ukraine right now? This is a question that India is facing, because India in the past has India has, I think, maybe even thousands of Russian tanks supported by Russian armed forces, planes as well, agriculturally with chemicals. Pakistan was historically supported by the United States, that axis seems to be changing after bin Laden was found in Pakistan. Imran Khan was in Moscow the day before the invasion. And there's a question now what India's role is. It's been abstaining. It abstained today as well, I think, in the United Nations resolution. And a lot of the justification of abstaining has been that, well, look what the West has done previously. But I don't know. I feel like in statesmanship, it's about what's happening now. I don't know. Ryan, this could have been prevented, but we are here very dangerous. The most dangerous period since I was born in 1978. Does seem to be escalating on a global scale. Yeah, that's a good point. 100. That is a good point, and it's there have been some deaths in Kharkiv that have been reported. Distinct Ukraine and Moldova asked the EU if they join the EU. Yeah, it's a very long process to join the European Union. There are lots of things lots of requirements you have to pass. I think Turkey's in the very early stages of doing that, so I believe it's more symbolic. But it shows that if you're a country that, even if you're, that's Taiwanese stream gone down, I think. If you're a country that shares values
in an all
with your West neighbours, but you are not in NATO, then ultimately it seems like for NATO it's tolerable for you to be invaded. Yeah, I heard that design, but I think that happens all the time. I hear about in the UK with Russian bombers kind of getting close to UK airspace. I think it's something that happens all the time. Obviously, everything's a bit on edge at the moment, so there's a higher chance of there being a miscalculation. Oh, this is an IL-76 from Slovakia. This is a very unusual plane, isn't it? An IL-76 from Slovakia looks to be heading to Moscow through Belarus. That is a very I don't know if anyone knows what's going on here, but that is a very unusual flight. Welcome, Samantha. Yeah, we've got Forte here as well. Yeah, I haven't heard that speech from Sweden. I think another big question is that if Putin is successful in Ukraine, you know, success is a very simple word, but broadly successful, and is able to control Ukraine or install a favourable government, maybe change the election procedure or something, I don't know. So he's successful in Ukraine. Belarus, we know, is highly, heavily aligned, though I think a weak spot in that alliance. If Putin wants to move again, I think there's big questions about Moldova's position here. I don't know what's been spoken about with Moldova, but surely you'd be very worried if you're in Moldova. But if Putin is heavily emboldened by that and does have this desire to reclaim previous Soviet territory, is there any further military aggression he could do that would still be tolerable to NATO? Because at the moment NATO doesn't tolerate what Russia is doing, then we're in a World War III situation. We're in a World War III situation, and then the final escalation is World War III with nuclear weapons. So at the moment we've got Russia invading a lowercase ally of NATO, which is Ukraine. It's not a member of NATO, but a government that shares NATO's values. And that is to some extent tolerable to NATO, i.e. NATO is not providing direct military support, although the lines are blurred. Then let's say Russia, starts escalating things in Estonia. That's another level of aggravation. Is that still tolerable to NATO? Because at whatever point NATO stops tolerating this, then win a World War III situation. And the only thing preventing mass destruction is the theory, really, of mutually assured destruction. So that is how things could escalate. And it's a question about whether, if things go well for Putin, whether he will be emboldened, and if things go badly, whether he will look to escalate his way out of the situation. Super, I think we will tolerate everything except NATO countries. Are you sure? Every NATO country? Are you sure there would be a world war over Estonia? I'm just hypothesizing. Having said that, all of the sanctions, no support, and arming Ukraine, it's hard to claim we're not a war nut. The lines are definitely very blurred, aren't they? The lines are definitely very blurred. It would be interesting if, well, I say interesting is such a inappropriately light term, but it would be interesting if Russia calls NATO's bluff on supplying and says you are part of this. Jonathan, Russia has so many nuclear capabilities that I think the problem is that America and other countries don't want nuclear war. Yes, that's exactly, I think, the point. Jolanda, VDA delivers nuclear fuel from Russia to Slovakia. Okay. So this is a very, very, very unique plane. Again, shows how the world is interconnected. David Nightshine host with qualifications. I'm not a military expert. I'm not a geopolitics expert. I've talked on previous streams about why I'm interested in this and the countries I've been to and the things I've done. Samantha, there seems to be a lot of fake news on both sides. It's very hard to figure out what to believe at the moment. I think there is definitely a lot of fog of war. And depending on what maps you read, I've seen Chinese maps, I've seen Russian maps. The territorial gain maps look very different. Well, they're not massively different. If you like communism, you know what Putin is doing. Putin isn't a communist. I think there's a difference between authoritarianism and communism. Brave Dove, I feel sad for all children of the world. First pandemic crisis and now this. My kids are scared to death. And it's very difficult to clear their fears. I just try and limit news. Yeah, you can't be too exposed to this. And again, if anyone is watching this and it makes you more anxious and scared and it's negatively affecting you, then I would say don't watch this stream and you don't need to follow the news. That's a privilege we all have by not being in Ukraine. Thanks, Jonathan. Sorry, Joseph, I can't read everything. It's not. There's a discussion as well in the comments. Super White, what if Russia nuked Georgia? I saw Georgia has applied to be in the European Union. So it's interesting because this is something I really can't explain. I don't have the skill to explain this, but it's... If you think of it of like a bully in the playground, for example, if the bully wants something to happen, they might bully people to achieve that objective. But the process of bullying makes other people not align with that bully's objectives. If that makes sense. So if Russia's objectives were to stop countries that were previously under the Soviet sphere of influence from turning westward, then this action at the moment seems to be turning them westward. I don't know if there's a word to explain that, but to see Georgia, I think also on the steps to formally applying to EU membership, which again I think is quite symbolic. It's very interesting. Will Bates, I don't think Putin wants nuclear war, the risk is too high. However, there are so many nukes in the world that will always be there, or there'll be an extinction war at some point. Depends how you balance mutual destruction and the weak points of it. But I think the increasing question in the West is, what are Putin's motives? Is he being counselled by people of different opinions? Or is he increasingly isolated, but still in control, but isolated in terms of decision making, and therefore the decision whether things go nuclear is down to one person's brain, the chemical reactions in there. And I think this is the thing about, we spoke yesterday about, it's very easy for people to get divided. Ultimately, whether you agree with your leaders if you're living in the West and you agree or disagree with your leaders, you should have the chance as a electorate to replace them. And that's quite a different position. Liam, do you think the convoy heading for Kyiv is close to Kyiv? Yeah, I understand that there's been satellite imagery showing it basically backed up to this airport, which is a huge strategic objective. Russia tried to capture it on the first day. We've seen footage of it. Liam, do you think Russia can survive as a country with these sanctions in place? I think definitely, yeah. I mean, you've seen that countries like North Korea can survive, heavily isolated. I feel we had a poll on this yesterday, it probably pushes Russia to be more alienated and the Russian population to be more against the West, I suspect. Brave Dove, if Putin wins the ground and does sanctions get lifted, I'm unable to foresee how sanctions get lifted in a situation. I just can't foresee that runway towards sanctions getting lifted. Thanks, Liam. Yeah, if you are enjoying the stream, do feel free to subscribe if you want. I'm streaming every evening. I've come to that. There will be sim racing content as well. Maybe you like both if you're in that tiny Venn diagram of people that absolutely love Gran Turismo 7 and are very interested about geopolitical events. You can also like stream as well if you want. It's up to you. Don't need to. Samantha, sanctions will get worse if he takes Ukraine. I fluctuate. I don't know if there's actually, there's how many people watching? 1,300 people watching. Has anyone been watching these streams on this channel, in this community, since day one? Because I think my feelings are probably quite visible. But I don't know about people that have been watching, but I really felt like, I think it was day 3 when the Russians did those incursions into the streets of Kyiv along the boulevard. I really felt when dawn came up, that was the time for diplomacy, a ceasefire, a negotiated way out. And right now I feel, I don't know if it's because what I'm getting exposed to in terms of what I'm reading and watching, but I feel more likely this could escalate. Can I turn down the cameras? Can do. There you go, that's better. Oh, Samantha has 2 days. Dobbo's being Christopher Ryan, Dylan, Essing, Stevie Slow. Wow, that is absolutely crazy, but I do feel proud that we're all engaged in this and trying to foresee what the effects will be. And anyone that has been following since day 1, day 2, I think there, again, I said yesterday, it might be confirmation bias, but I think there are a lot of things that we did call, like how important strategically this airport was, the potential miscalculation by the Russian forces in being welcomed into cities that hasn't happened, the change in tactics to be more destructive in the weaponry, things I definitely called wrong. In fact, can you let me know in the chat what are the big things that over the streams I've called wrong? So I think I called wrong that I couldn't see how Ukraine would really repel this, although it's very early to say, but I think the progress has been less than I expected. I thought Russia would establish air superiority almost immediately. That hasn't happened. But let me know anything else that I've definitely got wrong. There are a lot of things that we have called right in terms of the importance of Article 5, the inability of the Security Council to really be able to do anything because of the veto, Putin's motives being difficult to understand. Yeah, I haven't understood Putin's motive. Yeah, I've read the reports on martial law in Russia. I don't know if that's a step to enable more conscripting, etc. Joseph, I think you've been thinking micro instead of macro. Okay. Christopher, we all thought Kyiv would fall immediately and it just hasn't. Samantha, you were with me and thought negotiations were going to go ahead. Now no one wants to negotiate on either side. We'll see. I think there meant to be more negotiations tomorrow, but the first day... I think the first day of negotiations was possibly more important in establishing that connection. So even though nothing seems to be achieved, just establishing that line of communication and that framework to have negotiations could be very important. Leon, why is Russia holding back their air force? I don't know. There's obviously, in war, in the 21st century, there is always a degree of restraint. There's a Geneva Convention on how you treat prisoners of war. There's the bans on chemical and biological weapons. If you're Russia, there's the restraint on using nuclear weapons. So there's always a degree of restraint. And here this is probably amplified by the fact that the invasion, from what I saw on Russian state TV, was portrayed as a specific military incursion to support the liberation of, or independence of people in the east of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. And that would preclude a very destructive invasion. The narrative on that is obviously going to change. But yeah, there is a degree of restraint, incredibly, even when your soldiers are dying, civilians are dying, so much is on the line. So why isn't Russia using all of its air force? I don't know. That's shooting. Indeed, the convoy still remains like sitting ducks. It may be that there is literally a traffic jam because they cannot progress anymore. But if they have air superiority, and I understand there's lots of Russian anti-air alongside that column, then they're not at danger of being bombed from the air. Although we understand that the TB2 drones from Turkey have been effective in getting past Russia's anti-air defences. Maybe I just talk about so many different possibilities that if you talk about every possibility, then yeah. Pollock not destroying electricity is weird. Yes, I agree. I understand there's, still... heating may have been disabled today, but still flowing water, electricity. Joe, one thing Russia is good at is misinformation and just plainly accusing the other side of what they accuse them of. We have spoken about how I think in the West, the sophistication of Russia's misinformation sometimes seems to be fairly basic. But that might be the language barrier, I don't know. Welcome, Billy. Martin, did Belarus already engage in the fight? We looked yesterday at the Belarusian president showing his generals maps of the invasion, including an invasion into this, I think, disputed region on the east of Moldova, which is absolutely extraordinary. We talked about the body language and what that means. Something that we've been saying for quite a long time is that Belarus seems to be a weak point of this alliance. You may be able to, and Belarus was just so important for Russia for this invasion. I think this map here is the most restrained map I've seen when it comes to Russian advances. Other maps I've seen really do, by the way, show a general incursion from the north, east and the south. Techno thoughts the Romanian MiG that went missing. I don't know too much about it, actually, I'm afraid. But it's something that could have been an accident. A MiG-21 is a very old fighter jet. Welcome mission win out. Hello, I'm from Slovakia. The Russian planes are transporting nuclear fuel. Yeah, we've heard that. I mean, that is two satellite maps now. That is extraordinary. It does show just how interconnected. Obviously, you have the International Space Station, heavily reliant on Russian cosmonauts, Russian spaceports. There's a Russian rocket at the moment with UK satellites in the payload. That looks like it's not going to go ahead. There are nuclear reactors in Ukraine. You know, yes, incredible. Duke 43, let's have a look. Duke 43 is a helicopter, so we've seen that circling. Let's see if we see any more Eurofighters on patrol. F-16. Here's a F-16. No, Typhoon Eurofighter. Possibly escorting something, as we've seen before. Putin is also gripping reality. This is something that I've seen about, again, thinking the bigger picture. The more authoritarian a state becomes, the less questioning the leadership has. And the Soviet Union, when you go through the leaders like Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, Gorbachev, as the three others in between, the council was always had a lot of infighting, politics, and there was a lot of conflict there. Right now, just even the imagery of Putin sitting on these very long tables at the end, the imagery portrays him as being isolated. And there's a question mark about whether the natural path for when a state becomes more authoritarian is that the leader becomes isolated, not necessarily weaker, but isolated from differing viewpoints. So, for example, maybe isolated from different assessments on Russian military capabilities. And that makes sense. I think the more dangerous thing is that when those states are nuclear armed, then the decision to deploy nuclear weapons may also be isolated. We've spoken on these streams about the constitutional history of Soviet Union, Russia, and why the constitutions have been amended. Constitutions have been amended to eventually give more power to the president. Whereas in the United States, famously, there can be gridlock in terms of the executive because of House of Representatives, the Senate, and the president. What's commonly referred to as checks and balances. There's a jet flying in Budapest. Can't see anything here. RSP, let's plug it in. Yeah, I'm very aware that, and I've spoken about the countries I've been to here and the things I've done in terms of, being interested in geopolitics. But I have to be not clouded, but my perception is through the context of where I am, which is in the West. Let me put that in. Another IL-76 from Tunisia. Maybe taking a very wide flight plan. I don't know. We'll keep that. Please try and keep it respectful in the chat. We've got a very nice space here. 1,400 people watching, and it has been, I would say, I guess, but I think it has been the most balanced place to follow and discuss this war. The mods are just absolutely on it. The mods have complete air superiority in this chat. Grant, it is inevitable that Russia will prevail. Russia will suffer financially for years. It will put massive pressure. Do you mean fail or prevail? Prevail means that Russia will win. I think this alienates Russia. I think it will possibly galvanise the Russian population more against the West. I think it pushes Russia more into the sphere of influence of China. It gives China a difficult decision to make about whether China wants to solidify kind of the security importance, or it wants to continue with the globalised way it's integrated in terms of exporting. It puts India in a difficult position because India's relationship with Russia may become weaker because Russia has more reliance and close ties with China. So there's possible for India to kind of switch axes. India, arguably the most democratic out of those three countries, but still abstaining on resolutions. Yeah, we got Forte 12, I believe. Oh no, we don't. We don't have Forte 12, but we keep losing it. It's here. Thanks, Jay. But Putin eats KFC with a fork. I guess if you're having popcorn chicken from KFC, Mike, I wonder if they will push for Kyiv tonight. I would imagine that I imagine there is absolutely huge. We talked a few days ago about how there'll be huge fighting in Kharkiv, in Kherson, in Mariupol as well, in the Donbass. But I imagine there is also huge fighting here, or maybe the Ukrainians are very entrenched, because once Irpin and this airport area falls, it seems to be that Russia will be able to encircle Kyiv. So this is the thing about when I say we can be very easily divided. Like the fact I said about maybe you can eat popcorn chicken with a fork will divide us. Danny, I'm in a right uncertainty. Man's worst invention is a nuclear bomb. Now gives a lonely man defective power. This is a very interesting question. Because a lot of people will say the reason why there hasn't been a world war since 1945 is because of nuclear weapons. The combination of Article 5 in the NATO treaty and the theory of weapons of mutually assured destruction means that there hasn't been a world war. But I think it also means that countries that are not part of a pact with a nuclear power it's more tolerable for them to be invaded. And we saw an extraordinary statement from Japan on that. Billy, Putin won't use the nukes if he wants to go down in history. This is a thing again about, and I really struggle to explain this, but if you have a more authoritarian system, then you concentrate power in the leader at the top. Not saying they become weaker, they become stronger, but they become more isolated. But when you concentrate power in one individual, what happens if that individual is terminally ill? What happens when that individual comes to the end of their life? Then they have less to lose. Whereas when you have a system and a framework and different voices are heard, then you would stand to reason you get more of a balanced opinion. But if you concentrate things in one person and their particular circumstances, the consequences of, and if you corner that person, then so what if there's a nuclear war? It's less, from that perspective of that person. The consequences are lesser. If the consequences are only to that person, then it doesn't matter whether you die of old age or illness or assassination or nuclear war. They're all ways that you would die. So it's something that I really struggle to explain, but maybe I'll be able to in the upcoming streams. let's do how many people watch. We've got 1,600 people watching. Let's do our. We kind of do this every night, right? Let's do our location check. If you want to, put in the chat where you're watching from, and again we'll get a kind of view of where people are from. It seems to be last few days we have a lot of people watching in the United States, a lot of people watching in Europe, but we also have people watching all over the world. Peru, Bolivia, New Zealand, India, all over. Here we go. Jugan's from Estonia. Jugan, let me know what you're perceiving the position to be in Estonia. Is Estonia worried about Russian aggression? Does Estonia feel very happy to be part of NATO? Obviously, I'm asking you to speak on behalf of all Estonia, but how do you feel? Woody, Scotland, Blake, Florida, Andrew, UK, John, Australia, Shooting, Australia, Ratislav, Slovakia, Sparky, USA, Mostly Moscow, Healthy, Ohio, Nightlight, UK, Dragos, Moldova. Dragos, if you're in Moldova, what's the position in Moldova? Is Moldova right now arguably is the most exposed country in the world security-wise, you could say. California, THD from Brazil, Baby Cakes Ireland, Brian, okay, the Alex Chester, Daniel from Sweden, Robert from Germany, Robert from Germany. ESAT says your Estonian friends are concerned. You have to say you would much rather right now, from a very geopolitical security perspective, be in Estonia and part of NATO and the European Union than be in Moldova, surely. Danny, Finland is surely more exposed. I think there's obviously history between Finland and Russia and wars that have been waged and lack of success for Russia. It is a good point, though. Yeah, I'm not saying Moldova's NATO. I'm saying Estonia is in NATO. Moldova is not in NATO. So surely, from a security perspective, you'd rather be in Estonia because NATO would ostensibly draw its boundary here. So again, let's play this through again. So NATO's perspective is that what is happening in Ukraine is tolerable enough to not provide military support and risk the invocation of Article 5. So what's happening in Ukraine is tolerable enough for NATO. I don't know if anyone disagrees with that. Surely people will disagree with that. So if you disagree, then let me know. But what's happening in Ukraine is tolerable enough for NATO not to provide direct military support, although it is going right up to that threshold and arguably blurring it by supplying fighter jets and military equipment, etc. Moldova is also not in NATO. So you would presume that the same doctrine would apply to an invasion of Moldova. Again, it would be a further step of aggression, but the ultimate threshold you would presume would still not be met. Now, Estonia is a member of NATO, and theoretically, if Estonia is attacked by Russia, then Estonia can invoke Article 5. But there may be another threshold. There may be another threshold where Estonia is, in very simplistic and way too simplistic terms, Estonia is not worth World War III to NATO. And therefore there's actually another threshold. I don't know. I'm just speculating. I don't see this really talked about. Brave not tolerable enough. Is Ukraine worth sacrificing so the rest of the world can live without nuclear war? Marius, like we are in Lithuania, worried that if something happens with your front line, don't think NATO. If anyone's living in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, what is the... And I've been to Latvia and I've been to Lithuania. What is the perspective in terms of... But again, surely you, from a security perspective, much better to be in NATO than to not be in NATO, as we're seeing in this part of the world. But there may be another threshold. I don't know. I'm speculating. Shivanshi, NATO hasn't been successful in any conflict to date. NATO is well, in the West, I think we view NATO as a defensive pact. So the fact there hasn't been World War III would be deemed as a success of NATO. The context, I think, in Russia is different, where I think NATO can be seen as more of an aggressive force, but I think that's very contextual. We've spoken about that a lot on these streams. Martin, that's an interesting idea for mere mortals, perhaps the way to reason, but for organisations like NATO, it would mean their existence is pointless. It's, again, if you view it as a deterrent, then to exist as a deterrent, you may view all nuclear weapons as pointless because of mutually assured destruction. So if you really believe in mutually assured destruction, then essentially nuclear weapons are to some extent pointless because you can never fire them. But they act as a deterrent. There's very big questions here that are way above my knowledge and, you know, ability to even communicate. I can see there are very big questions here. The US Defense Secretary today said they're not going to increase DEFCON. They didn't see the statements by Putin as really credible. I think it was Lavrov, maybe, I remember. Frost, NATO's problem is that they don't want to risk a World War III, but at the same time they can't just sit back and do nothing. So this is a statement I said on yesterday's stream, is that so again, let me know if you agree or disagree with this. So the statement is NATO will only intervene in a conflict if there is militarily, if there is no risk of World War III, or if it is World War III. And this Ukraine conflict sits in the middle. So do you disagree with that? NATO will only interfere in a conflict or involve itself in a conflict if either it's not going to lead to World War III, for example, Afghanistan, or it's already World War III. Danny, what's your thoughts on no-fly zone? We on the very first stream we did on the first day of the war, I speculated that there was a window to implement and to enforce no-fly zone, but that window had passed. That window was prior to the invasion for Ukraine to request NATO to enforce no-fly zone. Jurgen agrees. Jurgen, you're in Estonia, right? And if you are in Estonia, if I remember correctly, do you think a conflict in Estonia would, where would it sit amongst that? Gary, we can intervene without NATO getting involved. That's true, but that doesn't... This is the other thing. If NATO, in terms of just on paper with conventional weaponry, NATO could, in a very isolated sense, end this war very quickly. But it's the context of Article 5 and the context of nuclear weapons that means that it isn't. Jonathan says we're kind of stupid. Brian, I think we could fight the Russian Air Force over Ukraine skies without triggering Article 5. I think the risk is that and I think it's debatable whether actually Article 5 would be triggered by NATO losses over the territory of Ukraine or in territory of Ukraine, because that wouldn't necessarily be NATO territory, unlike 9/11, which was on NATO territory. But I think that even if that was possible, I think it's the risk of miscalculation, the risk of escalation. It's a real important point for NATO, this, because it's very easy to be a deterrent on paper, but now NATO has to be a deterrent in practice, and Russia is the one that is aggressing and testing that. Jurgen, I believe in NATO, but isn't surprised if NATO doesn't do nothing if Russia's come for Estonia. Silver, NATO has stated an attack on the borders to start nuclear. Yeah, I mean, NATO can state that, but if World War III is on the line, there's another question, by the way, beyond that, which is, if a threshold is reached for NATO to intervene because it's World War III, is there another threshold where Russia and NATO can be at war with each other but not use nuclear weapons? The ultimate threshold that has to be reached before there would be a nuclear war. So the thresholds preventing a nuclear war from happening are either the conflict isn't going to start World War III, or the conflict is going to start World War III, and then finally the conflict starts World War III, and also it spills over from being conventional into nuclear. And at what stage does someone have to authorise the implementation of mutually assured destruction. Like, what has to be on the line? And if you think about rationally for countries, mutually assured destruction is a rational theory. Rationally, and I've explained it before, mutually assured destruction is like, let's say you live in a glass house and your neighbour lives in a glass house, and occasionally you disagree about things. What stops you throwing your stone is that your neighbour will throw a stone back, and then you won't have your glass house. Now that makes sense rationally if you care about your glass house, if you care about your territory. But the more irrationality that's introduced into that logic undermines mutual destruction. And if you have one person who is isolated and maybe is at the threat of destroying their legacy, perhaps being assassinated, old age, terminal illness, many different things, then the deterrent of losing your territory is perhaps not as starkly obvious to, you know, an infrastructure of elected politicians, etc., representatives. I don't know. Martin, what if you let someone else throw a stone at your neighbour's house? That's kind of NATO, isn't it? Collective defence. DV, it's just a madman tactic. Billy, if nukes weren't a thing and advanced chemical warfare wasn't a thing, do you think this had already escalated? I'm not sure what you're saying, because under the Geneva Convention, chemical and biological warfare are banned. Well, there are some treaties that Russia say they haven't signed up to. Mode, we're too conscious these days to cause World War III. There is, and again, we spoke on the very first stream, there is this unease. I think mutually assured destruction is to some extent game theory, but there is a inherent unease about world peace is dependent upon the existence and the readiness of weapons which will destroy the world. There is, I think, I definitely feel uneasy about it. So it's almost like the gut feeling is this doesn't feel right, but the logic stands up. So I think most people wouldn't want to see it tested anyway. And if things get miscalculated, you know, for example, with this Romanian plane, if things get miscalculated and then it even comes into the equation, in the same way that right now we're seeing NATO's Article 5 invocation getting tested a little bit, and these uncomfortable questions about, well, would it be invoked for Estonia? It's better when these questions aren't tested in a way, I suppose if you have that perspective. So the chat is very fast today, 1,500 people watching. I'm not ignoring anyone, it's just the chat is flying. I'm trying to stop it. And by the way, I don't read comments in my head and then speak them out. I read them as I see them. Do you have to keep it in English though? Connect, we know MAD doesn't work. It's a bit debatable, I think, but I think MAD is a logic based on rationality. So if you introduce irrational actors, it's same in game theory, like Prisoner's Dilemma. What happens when you add irrational actors to a prisoner's dilemma? Definitely, I think one of my failings that has been pointed out on these streams is that I try and apply too much logic and rationality to things, and on that basis, it doesn't seem to provide a way through to understanding what the reasoning is in Moscow. Yeah, I would expect that this was a complete coincidence. There were some other coincidences first day of the war that I thought would be coincidences. I can't remember what they were. Even a lot of the shooting that we heard in the capital, not during the night, but previously the night, may have just been... Yeah, the example was the armoured personnel armoured personnel carrier that ran over the car. My view is still that was likely to just be a mistake. MBR Defence Secretary didn't put much credibility into nuclear sanctions. Yeah, I saw that. Again, that is a de-escalatory statement. You can imagine that if the United States had responded by increasing nuclear readiness, then that would be retaliated against, and then suddenly we'd have B-52s and Russian Tupolev bombers around the world carrying nuclear bombs in readiness. Struggling today with my cough. Another strepsil. Welcome, some tall dude. Robert, a rational man does not go to war. Not sure about that. But a rational man, you'd think wouldn't go into a war with nuclear weapons. Or a rational man wouldn't instigate a nuclear war. But the danger is that things just spiral and miscalculate, and people get put into corners, and rationality kind of takes a second step. We're not going to go on that late today, by the way, because it's a weekday, so we're going to stop at midnight UK time. Tyson, do you think Moldova invasion is a possibility? I feel like the security situation in Moldova must be very tense at the moment. I haven't seen much news or coverage about it. Gregor, at what point the West will admit they have set expectations that were not reasonable? I do feel as though that I've got a really sore throat today. We might have stopped this one early today. I do feel as though there's been a miscalculation in the West that the fall of the Soviet Union meant that a lot of the negative perception from Russia to the West had gone. Because effectively Ukraine right now is a buffer state for the West, and in a way Belarus is a buffer state for Russia. And again, we saw the Chinese representative in the United Nations Security Council saying that Ukraine has to be a bridge between East and West. I don't think it's spiralling yet, but it could spiral. That's another question, Rasta, about whether Putin would use some kind of tactical nuclear weapon to again see if that meets the threshold. Yeah, I've heard questions about that mission winner to the US Secretary of State. He said he can put himself in Putin's mind, but it seems worrying that it's not easy to work out what the logic is, what the rationality is. Therefore, it might be something else. I think, chat, There's 1,500 people watching. I think we're going to go slow mode. I don't have my voice is failing me. Sammy, do you think Russia will occupy Ukraine after all these sanctions? I don't see. I think yes. I don't see. I can't foresee how the sanctions are going to be de-escalated. I can't see that. It feels like the. I can see that if Russia really fails in this invasion, then it's more likely there will be a regime change in Moscow. But the more likely there is to be a regime change, the more it corners the regime, and the more likely the regime might try and escalate their way out of that. I don't have the foresight to kind of see how sanctions would be de-escalated. Murray, could you imagine how advanced the human race would be if we weren't so busy being afraid of each other? You could say arguably that a lot of technological advancements come in times of war. For example, rockets to space because of developing technology for intercontinental missiles. Do you think Putin is running out of things he can lose? It's very early to say in this war. This war may turn out to be quite a significant success for Russia. Just because they're incurring casualties, that may be a price that is deemed worth paying. And then we would live in a situation where, there's a Russia-controlled or affiliated Ukraine right up against the borders of NATO. What that means for Moldova, I don't know. Actually, has there been any confirmation of Ukrainians receiving supplies? I've seen a few. I've seen a few confirmations. Here's one. I've also seen a lot of question marks about how they're going to make their way into Kyiv, for example. It's just too late for that. And I do think there is a difference between countries wanting to show domestically that they have done something, and the practical reality of whether that makes its way to the right people is almost a secondary question. I think we spoke on a few previous streams about ways this war could have been avoided, and one is that whether NATO really needed to. Okay, I'm going to try and explain this. Fall of the Soviet Union, there's perception that it was the end of history. The West had, inverted commas, won the international framework of the United Nations, and these supranational organisations had legitimacy, and Russia was a part of that. That was the perception, albeit a Western perception. It seems to be that, at least in Putin's justification, that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the West, and particularly the USA, was just able to do what it wanted in the world. And the United Nations, it was a faux legitimacy, really. They just legitimised the United States' actions as the sole superpower and the world's policeman. I do wonder to what extent, if NATO had basically dissolved after the fall of the Soviet Union, whether there wouldn't have been that pressure on Russia, and it wouldn't have pressurised Russia into the situation, and Russia would have become more integrated. I don't know. I don't know to what extent there is this, especially from Putin, this sort of idea of legacy and entitlement to these people in their territory. You also had the breakup of Yugoslavia and Kosovo, and Because the only time that Article 5 has been invoked, which was after September 11th in Afghanistan, really, whether Article 5 would have been invoked or not, wouldn't really, I think, have made too much difference there, to be honest. I think where NATO did make a difference was in Kosovo. Because of the inability of the Security Council, I think, to agree on that. Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, the abstentions were interesting. So it's interesting that, again, if we think of the world in the very simplistic way as a playground, if you think who are the friends of Russia, the countries that voted with Russia, the countries that voted, with Russia against the resolution were Syria, North Korea, and I think possibly Eritrea. I don't know who else voted with Russia. And it's one of these things that you may be able to tell a lot about you can tell a lot about a person by their friends. One of the things that may kind of also be a helpful analogy on the world stage. Vega, should Ukraine join NATO? I'm not sure NATO would want Ukraine in NATO, to be completely honest. Ukraine at the moment is a buffer state for NATO. So Russia is invading Ukraine, NATO can supply Ukraine with weapons, it gets good intelligence about Russia's military capabilities, and Ukraine at the moment is a buffer state. The question, NATO doesn't have to ask itself that question about whether the threshold has been reached for Article 5 invocation against Russia if a NATO member is invaded, because Ukraine is a buffer state. Yeah, Sammy said it's interesting that statement from China that I think about a lot, about Ukraine has to be a bridge between East and West. I've spoken and thought a lot about it. I mean, you could argue that China has a bit of a similar situation with North Korea being a little bit of a buffer state. But I think in the West there was a perception that Russia would not have done something like this. And that seems to be a miscalculation. The feelings were there in the Russian state that this was necessary. And on that basis, maybe I don't know. Maybe there should have been more care given about statements and actions with Ukraine and joining NATO. Because ultimately, I don't think NATO would have wanted Ukraine to join NATO. Yeah, Helen, it was interesting when we were watching that night, through the night and into the morning, about the Russian incursion here. It definitely is an indication that the Russians are able to get into Kyiv very early on in the war. And it would have put the city on high alert, and there's many reasons why that could have been done. Could have also been a low percentage chance to try and capture or eliminate the Ukrainian president. Yeah, a large number of countries abstained, but you've got to remember that China abstained and India abstained, and that's billions of people. I think China is much more on the Russian side of the spectrum than India at the moment. India has some really big questions to kind of think about where it wants to align itself politically. I think India, as state-wise, would be quite happy to just not be involved. But given that even Switzerland is enacting sanctions, I believe, shows that it kind of is one where sides are being taken. Danny, do you think the Ukraine president will get to survive? I think it would be a very key objective for Russia to remove the Ukrainian president, because at the moment there is still a formal Ukrainian state that was elected, practically, that a lot of leaders in Western countries will have been with at conferences, sat next to at dinners, as I've said. and they can respond to formal requests from the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government was able to sign an application to join the European Union, however symbolic that may be. If the head of the state is eliminated or captured, then suddenly you're talking about more of a resistance. I think there is a harsh reality if you subscribe to kind of the realpolitik way of viewing international relations, that it's NATO would really rather Ukraine wasn't part of NATO. Hoggy, why can't a country stand on its own 2 feet? Yeah, it's that saying about from China that Ukraine needs to be a bridge in East and West. Again, if you take a realpolitik approach to it, might be drowned out. Then the reality is that Ukraine is a buffer state between blocks of competing interest. So by utilising its sovereignty to go one way or the other, the reality is that it will anger one side. And you could say that the West supported the Orange Revolution in 2004. Before that, Ukraine was much more Russian leading. It supported the Euromaidan protests. Before that, Ukraine was much more Russian leading. And after Euromaidan, when Ukraine became more West leaning, Russia annexed Crimea. So whichever way Ukraine has gone, you could argue that one bloc has exerted power. I think it's important to note that the West has never invaded Ukraine. But that's just the capital R realism of the situation. You'd imagine the same happened in Belarus. There were protests against the president a few months ago. Russia assisted the president. So that's just reality situation. What's the time? With Ukraine will fall. World War III won't happen. Russia will be free of sanctions in 6 months. We will see. I mean, I hope we're not streaming every night for 6 months on this. I really hope we're not. But we will see. I can't foresee how the sanctions are going to be lifted. Refresh this. Yeah, I've seen a few reports about this. I don't know if they come from the same source, but Russia imposing martial law, I imagine that enables them to have higher amounts of conscription and deploy more supplies. Daniel, would laying down all resistance then wait for Russian troops to leave? I wouldn't be surprised if Ukraine... Yeah, I'd imagine Ukraine really does want a ceasefire, but I think the preconditions from Russia will be recognition of Crimea, eastern regions, and some kind of guarantee that Ukraine won't join NATO. I'm beginning to think that it's a really difficult position because it's almost like the strategists in NATO surely wouldn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. But from a political perspective, that's almost not acceptable to concede that. So, I don't know. I can carry on. Welcome to our Taiwanese audience. I feel like this stream is starting to become a bit more targeted, which is a bit sad. It's a bit sad. If that's accurate, it's very quiet airspace over Poland. Very quiet airspace over Poland. Extremely quiet for midnight. Yeah, we saw that Dragos. I haven't seen so much reporting on the situation in Moldova. I saw that about the World Bank, Alina. Grant says Putin seems to have gone against his advisors. Questionable to what extent. We saw the imagery yesterday of Lukashenko in Belarus kind of pointing to this map to his generals, which is almost the wrong way the pyramid should be in a way in terms of who should really have military experience. Strategic military experience. I definitely think, Stephen, things are going to get more polarised. Akamati? Non-stop, why do you think the large convoy sat for over 24 hours? I suspect it's essentially backed up. If the Ukrainians are putting a very strong resistance at this airport here, and Irpin, then the convoy may be backed up. Thanks, Braun. Yeah, the mods are just absolutely on it. And these are sim racing mods. The thing about sim racing is, so if you're joining us, 1,600 people watching this channel, normally I do sim racing. So I race in this seat for, 3, 6, 8, 12 hours. And because I'm racing, the mods are very important. This community has a very, very strong community and lots of incredible mods. Don't normally to speak this much. But if you do want to subscribe for us tracking and discussing the war, then we are streaming every evening, UK time. I saw that non-stop train. I'm not sure about those reports. Oh, bottle of water, amazing. Shivansu, how do you think Russia plans on taking over Kyiv without too many casualties? I honestly don't know. It depends on where the Ukrainians kind of draw their border. The more the Ukrainian defence falls into the city, the more destructive it's going to be. Because to roll tanks down these streets is yeah. Well, I feel just bad for the terrified women and children that are horrifically dying and the ones that survive will suffer from shell shock. I completely agree. Completely agree. And if you have a view that there have been women and children and civilians being killed and suffering in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, then that's a completely valid opinion, but I don't think it means that you can't think it's also wrong in Ukraine. Billy, I think Putin will lose too much funding to finish this war. Well, I think the sanctions are definitely designed to apply pressure on Putin domestically. But there's a strong danger, I think, that if the narrative is lost in those sanctions, it will just galvanise more of the Russian population against the West, and we really end up in more of a Cold War situation. It's very interesting how that will work with the internet, but then why aren't the Ukrainians being evacuated? I think there's been 500,000 refugees who've gone to Poland. I think about 200,000 refugees have gone into Russia. So there's large amounts of refugees evacuating. But I think there's mandatory military service now. Any men from 18 to 60 are under mandatory military service. So do people pick and choose who they feel sorry for? If it fits the political social narrative, people can apply. Kiki, this radar is Flight 24. This is a live UA map. We have a subscription to both, so I think they load a bit quicker and we've got different maps available. Brett, what do you think about Belarus? I feel like Belarus is a weak part of this kind of alliance between Russia and Belarus. Obviously, Belarus was so incredibly important for the war because it allowed the Russian troops and the armour columns to progress down the west side of the river and completely changed the face of the war. But you'd think Belarus would be easier to prize away from Russia, some sort of weak point. Samantha, I feel sorry for the men too that had no choice but to fight. Didn't matter if they were mentally ill or unfit. If they were between 18 and 16, they had to stay. That's terrifying. I've seen a lot of Ukrainian sports people as well. Like, the mayor of Kyiv is a former world champion boxer. Must be a multi-millionaire. There's two world champion. There's a few world champion Ukrainian boxers now who have flown back in to fight. Tennis players as well. Football players, which is, I think, also hits home to the West because we will have seen these people on TV and in stadiums. Christian, how does Russia intend on keeping the silence of their soldiers when they return home? Their stories will obviously be different than what is being reported in Russian news channels. I don't know. It doesn't really matter what's going on now, though. It's how the war finishes. So the more that Ukraine fights back, the more horror stories there will be from Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soldiers. So it will just generally become more bloody. Yeah, I heard that, Iridex. I think that might just be something that happens from time to time. Harry says Putin won't stop until he's won something. Yeah, I think that's pretty clear that both sides need... The only way this can de-escalate is that if both sides come home with a win. For Ukraine, that might be... I don't know if it would be acceptable for Ukraine to formally recognise. I don't know, because there is the Minsk II agreement is dead, but there was the Minsk II agreement about setting up demilitarised zones and moving back weaponry. Brett, do you think KIA numbers are real on both sides? I think they'll be inflated on both sides, you'd imagine. Russia will take over, have access to Black Sea. Well, I think Russia have lost military access to Black Sea. Any warships from existing Black Sea ports, I believe, are allowed to return. But any ships from other Russian ports in the Baltic Sea, I don't think Turkey's going to permit them through the Bosphorus. Billy, this will be a time that brings the world together or a catastrophe apart. I think, unfortunately, Billy, although the West is being brought together, I think it's also going to bring together a opposite side, and it depends whether that is going to include China and it is going to include India. There'll be a sort of axis here. That's unfortunately, that's what I think. I also think the war changes significantly if the Ukrainian state is captured or eliminated. I think that changes things massively. Ultimately, the Ukrainian state does then lose that legitimacy of having leaders that have been elected, and it makes things more murky, and it becomes more of a resistance. So I do feel like we're in a little bit of a lull at the moment in terms of what we were seeing in the earlier days, but it's very scary to see how things could possibly re-escalate and almost inevitably will re-escalate. And what the state does in Moscow having been put into a corner. Game in NATO doesn't want to fail like it did in Bosnia. Yeah, the Minsk agreement is 7 years old with little implement. I think behind the scenes people expected it. If people did expect it, I don't think it had got into the wider West perception that this was a live situation that was unresolved, to be honest. You have to remember that Russia annexed Crimea after the Euromaidan demonstrations, supported the independence movement in the East, and was still part of the international framework. Still hosted the Winter Olympics, still hosted the Football World Cup, still was going to host Champions League final, Formula 1 races, still was, has a permanent seat on Security Council and veto. So again, in terms of what was tolerated, this was in some ways more than tolerated. It was seen as a status quo, but it seems like that was a miscalculation, actually. We hadn't, in the West, a lot of us possibly fully understood and appreciated the situation here. And if that is the case, and maybe any statement NATO made about exceeding Ukraine as a member, or any deployment of troops or missiles on the eastern front of NATO would have been highly inflammatory, but that wasn't really being perceived, I don't know. I think 44 million people in Ukraine, Brave Dog. That's figures for $10. What is your knowledge of economics of Russian defense and military? Don't know too much economically, although I don't think Russia relies that heavily on exports other than natural resources to, for example, Europe. Although Europe is heavily, Germany is heavily reliant on Russian gas. I think UK actually isn't that heavily reliant on Russian gas. I understand Norway's going to increase its exports. But it's a big question for China in terms of which way China wants to lean. China just may see Russia as acting too irrationally right now. I don't know. Obviously, Russia had been integrated in the Western framework economically, socially, culturally. And that is now being ripped apart economically, socially, culturally. Yeah, UK 5% on Russian gas. Obviously, the President EU Commission yesterday made a very powerful statement saying that Europe really needed to decarbonise. Sorry, that was loud. That was very loud in my headphones. Duke 43 is a helicopter we've been tracking most days. Yeah, sorry if that was loud. But I understand there are going to be negotiations tomorrow between Ukrainian representatives and Russian representatives. Hopefully, from my perspective, hopefully the situation can still be de-escalated, but it seems to get more difficult by the day. The sound is coming from Independence Square. This is a new camera, by the way. I think we may have had this camera yesterday with less lights. The Taiwanese stream has changed to camera. Yeah, the Taiwanese stream has changed its camera. What a chance Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons. To use tactical nuclear weapons would be such a clear provocation to NATO. It would almost be, again, testing where that threshold is. Testing how much can he get away with. And then, you know, whatever's below that threshold he can do. Martin, how would it be de-escalated? You think the minimum wins that Putin would need to take back would be recognition of the annexation of Crimea and recognition of the Donbass to be independent, Donetsk and Luhansk, and some kind of assurance that Ukraine will not join NATO. But even then, the reasoning that has been coming out from Putin and Lavrov and on the United Nations Security Council is a much stronger belief that the international framework, the rules-based order, just is unfit, or Russia doesn't believe in it, doesn't want to play by it. Thanks, Isaiah, for the $5 one. I'm not sure about that. Obviously, it's entitled to views. Yeah, doesn't want to play by the international orders, and I think there's a big danger. There's a big danger that Russia could either be ejected, evicted, or could decide to leave the United Nations and other institutions, and therefore those institutions would lose the legitimacy they've had since 1945. Mimi asks, is Mimi here? Only you can answer that. David, a truce is the only logical outcome, with agreement by the US to pull its missile base out of Europe. That is the sliver, right? The sliver of a rational de-escalation and negotiated exit would be that it's either going to go surely either going to go two ways. And I remember seeing a ex-NATO commander saying he believes there's going to be a massive escalation of readiness on NATO's eastern front, conventional armed forces, armour, etc. Back to Cold War. So either that's the path, escalation, and the only way to de-escalate would be completely opposite and have a de-escalation on the eastern front of NATO, a recognition that Ukraine is not going to join NATO, recognition of the specific circumstances in Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk, and a ceasefire. But that would take some incredible diplomacy for Putin to accept that and message it back and present it as a win, for the West to present the demilitarization of the Eastern Front of NATO as sensible, given that we've just seen Russia invade a country very close to the eastern front of NATO, and Ukraine as well. And I don't know, that seems like such a sliver. Yeah, the drones are manufactured in Turkey. I think Ukraine has single-digit numbers, or had about 40 on order. Sammy, I just find that Putin never agreed to the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, always trying finding ways to bring it back. Possibly. I think that was something that I hadn't really thought about too much, but it seems much more likely. Yeah, but I don't see a single positive outcome for anyone. I live in hope, but also with a huge slice of trepidation. It's a bit crystal ball gazing, isn't it? We're living it as well. 1,500 people watching this live stream. We're all from all over the world. We're all living it in it. And this isn't a play. It isn't a movie. It isn't a book. We don't know what's going to happen. There's room for miscalculation. There's room for error. There's room for strategic successes or strategic failures. There's definitely space for things to spiral and escalate. It seems like it becomes even more difficult for things to de-escalate. And it would require some incredible diplomacy to, I think anyway, get on that narrow path and de-escalate things. Yeah, if you find watching these streams makes you anxious or worried, then please don't watch them. You don't need to watch them. If you do find these streams valuable and they are reassuring or comforting or Robert says there is no good ending to this. I think in the war there is really no good ending objectively, because people die, and that's, in an ideal world, that seems unnecessary. I think it may be snowing or heavy weather at the moment. Welcome Sim Hub. When the first shot is fired, when the person pulls its failure, I think there's definitely been a failure of diplomacy to avoid the situation. But that may be a Western way of looking at things. The idea of the United Nations is to avoid conflict, is to avoid wars. But maybe the United Nations is inherently a kind of Western institution, even though it purports to be globally legitimate, because pretty much every nation is a member. Welcome, Susan. We spoke a lot yesterday about why Russia deemed it necessary now, given that its next generation tanks and planes aren't due for mainstream production until the next couple of years. maybe that access through Belarus was very important strategically and they were worried about the situation in Belarus changing. I don't know. Seasonal as well with the weather. But I definitely think from the West, if you'd asked pretty much anyone in the West, in fact, let's 1,500 people watching. Anyone watching right now, did anyone honestly, at the turn of the year, 1st of January 2022, was it on anyone's mind that in February Russia would invade Ukraine in such a significant way? Was it on anyone's mind? Thanks, Bones, $5. That is a question about. We saw the Moldovan president show Ukraine split up into zones. No, absolutely not. Paul says yes. Some people saying yes, but the majority, it wasn't on my mind. I think in the West, there was probably an idea that the situation was relatively settled. And that might have been similar to the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell. Okay, that question had been relatively settled. And if the question is settled, then it doesn't matter if NATO is expanding eastwards. It doesn't matter if the European is expanding eastward because those questions are settled. But if in Russia those questions really weren't settled and every expansion eastwards was a real security concern, then you can see how it's different. I really do feel there's possibly a difference of cultural perception there. I thought it was a possibility, but didn't think anything would actually happen. Not at all. Thanks, Carl, for $10. You didn't put a message there if you wanted me to see a message. Appreciate it. Because of the donations, we can subscribe to these things. And let me know as well if you've got any other sites you recommend that we can put up. I do think that Ukrainers sometimes look west, sometimes look east. 2004 Orange Revolution. 2014 Euromaidan demonstrations. And maybe Ukraine is in this impossible bind where if it looks west too much, then Russia will exert influence. If it looks east too much, the west will exert influence. And therefore it's in this impossible situation where maybe the Chinese delegate, I keep thinking about the statement, Ukraine has to be a bridge between the east and west. And if Ukraine looks more to one side or the other, then it just puts itself in this impossible situation. I don't know if that's just a capital R realistic way of looking at it. Refresh the map. Yeah, maybe we will see a kind of Western Ukraine because again, if you're Russia, you probably wouldn't mind a buffer state with NATO. Shane, do you think Georgia applying to EU is likely to implement everything? It probably puts Georgia more on the map. Again, we spoke about it earlier. If the idea was to deter countries kind of along this belt from looking westward, could even include Turkey in that, then Ukraine and Georgia have applied to join the EU. It hasn't worked at this stage in time. But if you essentially control the country and the state, then it doesn't matter. I think one of the biggest questions that I haven't seen spoken about today, but maybe we'll see when we stream tomorrow, we'll have seen more stuff, is what about Moldova? That's correct. Mandates were lifted, so the other shoe had to drop. Did not see this coming. I'm not sure there's two. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, I feel as though because Russia had annexed Crimea and had been supporting these regions, and even as a result of the conflict here, a Malaysian aircraft was shot down with hundreds of Dutch citizens on board. that still didn't lead to kind of increased sanctions and perhaps a more clear realization that this conflict is not settled and is going to explode again. Funny, how will this war end? I don't think anyone can possibly... Well, there's different ways. MBR, what Kara said, but thought it would take longer. Price of crude helped. JJ, Moldova won't be able to defend itself, but it's primarily Russian anyway and never base there. Moldova will sign the papers and say they're Russian. We'll see. I don't actually know too much situation in Moldova. Obviously, the Belarusian president showed a map that pointed to Russian troops going from Odessa into Moldova, or at least this transitory region. Brett, do you think Kyiv will fall and say when? I can't foresee how Kyiv doesn't fall unless there is a negotiated ceasefire. And it's just a question of how difficult and ultimately how destructive and sadly how many casualties there are in terms of Ukraine defending Kyiv. Funny, can Ukraine win Russia without NATO force? Do you mean defend? I don't think so, no. Bruce says Zelensky is an actor. I don't think anyone disputes that. By the way, it's 11:58. We are gonna 1,500 people watching. If you do want to see these streams again, we've been streaming every day. We streamed from midnight till 8 AM, I think, over the weekend, 2 days. So please do feel free to subscribe if you want to join us again. Weeknights. The other content on my channel is sim racing. There's a very big sim racing game coming out tomorrow. So there's lots of other content you'll see as well. But it's that time of the evening. If you have any other streams that you recommend, this one here is live stream events. So if you have any other streams that you recommend, please do put them in the chat. If you have any books or films that you recommend, put them in the chat. I'm not going to be streaming all night because I stay fresh, or try to stay fresh. Can also get too involved. Thanks, Harry. And thanks everyone in chat as well. There's more. It doesn't matter if you're where you are in the world. There is 100% more that I believe that we have in common that divides us. It's very easy to get divided alongside things that aren't that important, but apart from the bots, we're all human, and there's a lot more we have in common. So this is a very lucky space we have here, I think, to follow what's going on, discuss it, be engaged in it, be present. Everyone will be able to look back and be like, yeah, we were engaged in that, we were present, we were keeping ourselves up to date, we were thinking about the consequences. Yes, thanks a lot everyone for again making this such a interesting and diverse place with opinions to follow this and discuss it. Thanks, Fool, for the $5. I'm going to go to our members page. Remember, this is on my sim racing stuff. I do lots of alerts and gifs and memes, and this is my closing page. So it jars a little bit, but we're going to go there. And yeah, we'll be back. We'll be back tomorrow. Although tomorrow's going to be difficult because there's a very big game coming out. So if you do want to talk more about it, then there's a link to a Twitter thread, I think, in the description below. Follow me on Twitter if you want, and you can tweet things at me so I can see them, because only mods can send links in the stream. So if you do want to send me stuff, follow me on Twitter. There's a link in the description below. I hope everyone has a very good night if you're in Europe. Good day if you're in Australia. Don't know what it is if you're in America. Early evening. And yeah, it is midnight now, so I'm going to end this stream. Thank you so much for being with us again. And I'll see you all next time.
You are watching Kyiv card. You are watching a Kyiv card. Is there excitement? Is there anger? Maybe curiosity? Well, just let us know your thoughts in the comments. Ask any question you might want to ask. Is there excitement? Is there anger? Maybe curiosity? Well, just let us know your thoughts in the comments. Ask any questions you might want to ask. If you like what you see, then go ahead and feel free to subscribe to our channel. But if you want to see more and the blood's rushing in your veins, you can't wait till the next one, well then check the description and you'll find a link. You will find a link to Discord, a link to Discord. I know it may get difficult, things would seem dark, mind frozen like a tree's bark, but that should stop us to thrive. Get to the top, win the gold, and the thrill won't stop, because this is Kyiv card. Kyiv card. You are watching a Kyiv card. Is there excitement? Is there anger? Maybe curiosity? Well, just let us know your thoughts in the comments. Ask any question you might want to ask, because this is a Kyiv card. With the speed on show, now you're gonna know how to get fast like a dart, just like Kyiv card. You are watching Kyiv card. You are watching a Kyiv card. You are watching Kyiv card.